What's up everyone, just making a quick guide here on Bit Heroes. Now I know when I started out in this game there were a few guides on YouTube, however it was quite confusing in terms of a lot of the information that wasn't explained, so I intend to go over as much of that as possible and what I would suggest as the best courses of action in terms of progressing through the game. Now, when you start Bit Heroes, a lot of people will look at it as a class-based game, because there's multiple types of different weapons, multiple types of different builds, and you get stat points to allocate as you level. Now, the first thing I'll say when starting out is the best way to allocate your stat points is to spend them on attack. And the reason that I would say put everything into attack is because you can re-roll your gear to reallocate stats wherever you'd like them to be and base your build on those attack stats. So obviously if you have, for example, I have 400 and something in attack, which means I can re-roll a piece of gear into health that would otherwise be in attack. The main reason that I would suggest this over going for health, speed, or a mix is because every build in the game uses attack. If you're going to be a damage dealer or healer, you wouldn't have anything in health, because your gear would cover that and you wouldn't really need it. You don't need anything in speed at all if you're a tank. So it becomes irrelevant if you're a tank, which means, while you can still put points in HP and some in attack, it's easiest to progress through the earlier stages of the game as a damage dealer. By increasing your attack, you're increasing the damage you deal and the speed in which you'll be able to progress through the game earlier on. So that's why I would suggest getting that done in that way. Obviously, everyone is free to distribute as they wish. This is just my recommendation in terms of being efficient with your stat points. Now, when you start up the game, you will start through the questing area. I'm sure you'll see a lot of other content on my screen, which will be unlocked later on. However, in relation to questing, what you'll need to do is simply make your way through the flags until you reach dungeons. Now, dungeons are what you'll be grinding for the early parts of the game, and each dungeon has different familiars which it can drop for you to obtain. Now, based on the rarity of the familiar, they will have different percentage chances of being captured, as well as different chances of offering to join your party. Now, simply because they've offered to join you doesn't mean you'll capture them, and what a lot of people get a little bit confused about as well is the 200% capture rate. Doesn't mean there's 200% chance higher on the capture chance once they've asked to join you. It's 200% higher chance that they will give you that attempt to capture them. So when you go into a mob and you defeat it, and it has a 40% chance on normal, it'll have a 40% chance on heroic also. However, you're twice as likely, or 3 times as likely, because it's plus 200%, for that monster to attempt to join you, so that familiar. So that's one thing that gets a little bit confusing earlier on in the game. The next thing is, a lot of people will soon realize that upon coming to Zone 2, after breezing through Zone 1, is that you've really hit a wall, and your entire team will just start getting destroyed. Now, what you'll need to do is 2 main things. First of all is to obtain fusion familiars. So if we go down here, we have the familiar section, and then the fusion area. Now, when you capture a basic familiar, they have simply got their skills, their stats, and that's all there is to them. However, when fusing a familiar, they obtain an additional property. So that additional property can range from increased damage, block chance, damage reduction, and everything in between really. So as you can see in relation to this one, it has evade and redirect. However, this is a mythic familiar, so it's very unlikely you'll be looking at those early game. Even legendary familiars, I would suggest straying away from early game in terms of having them as your ideal for progression. Now, the reason I say this is because, while yes, you really do want to go for legendaries, you won't realistically be obtaining them until you started hitting raids. So don't have them as your I need this to progress, because you definitely don't. I made it all the way through to Raid 4 and completed all of the end content while Raid 4 was the maximum content, with simply 2 blue fusion familiars of Shramps and Borland. Now these will be your first goals. This area here, the Dryad's Hut, will be able to drop you 2 parts, one from each, and Lord Cerulean's Tomb will drop you the second part for Borland. Once you make your way through here with your Borland, you'll be able to eventually make it to Blubber's Gutter, in which you can then obtain Gramps. By putting a Gramps and a Shrump from this zone here together, you'll also have your Shramps. Now, with these familiars, you should be able to eventually get them maxed out. By that, what I mean is there's an option in familiars where you can stable additional types of the same familiar. So as you can see here, there's these little dots below them, and these indicate how many I have in my stable, boosting the stats. So what I can do here is, as you can see, if I were to stable one of my cogs, I currently have 2, I would gain an additional 62 total stat points for my other cogs. However, I'm using 2 in PvP at the moment, so it's not something I want to do, but when it turns into 4 familiar PvP or 4 unit PvP, I'll definitely put this back into the 1 cogs. Now, let's say you've made it through here, you've made it to this area, you now have your max Shramps and your max Borland. Your next goal will be to look through all the familiars as opposed to which ones you want to aim for in terms of legendaries. Now, the biggest thing that is, I guess, thought by new players, which is incorrect, is that as you progress, you will gain more XP. Now, this is incorrect. Every area in the game gives you more or less the same experience. Upping the difficulty will obviously give you increased chances, increased experiences, things like that. However, doing, for example, the final zone compared to the first zone, you'll be getting the same amount of experience. That would not really change. So with that out of the way, what you would need to do is, let's say for example, we're going for a legendary familiar, you will need to determine what you need to make that. So every legendary familiar that doesn't require you to catch multiple legendaries, or at least one legendary, would require you to make epics. So as you can see here, these are 3 different epics which you need to make. So what you would need to do is determine what locations you would need to grind to get these familiars to make this. Once you've got that completed, you can start grinding for your legendary familiar. Now, once you've got your familiars all going like that, you can then head off to raids. By the time you've got it unlocked, you should be able to have a few people added on your friends list, which will be quite strong. Now, in terms of getting a raid completed, it really does depend on your team as to what difficulty you can do. So, when you start out, you may need to do one of the easier difficulties, whether it be normal, hard. It doesn't really matter too much earlier on. Your main aim is to get a full set of epic gear. Generally, a full set of epic gear with 1 to 2 legendaries is enough to make it to the next raid. Very rarely would you need anything more than 1 legendary fully upgraded to make it to the next zone. Now, it has become a lot easier since the introduction of mounts. So, since having mounts introduced into the game, it is quite easy to gain quite a chunk of stat points without really doing anything. And the best thing about them is that if you craft a tier 1 mount and you get your character to the tier 2 location, your mount will instantly upgrade without you needing to do anything, and it will just give you more stat points as if it was a tier 2 mount. So there's no real worry in terms of saving your materials to craft a mount later on. You can just make it as early as possible to gain as much stats as possible. The next thing that's really important is making runes. So once you get a few rune fragments, you can start crafting runes. Now, minor runes are just your basic buffs in terms of gold find, capture rate, experience, and item find. Major runes are your general buffs in terms of stats, so whether it be absorb chance, empower chance, damage reduction, dual strike, damage, health, speed, and so on. So this is the main one you'll really want to focus on once you've crafted one or two of these. I would definitely suggest getting 2 of these initially, regardless of what you get, keeping them. Then I would go for a full 4 set of major runes. And I would attempt to, if there's a event on, aim for a reward in which would give you a major rune. Because they cost a lot more to craft and they'll gain you a lot more when you do scrap them if it's something you don't want. So there are a few of them which are more or less useless, including with the actual runes themselves. There are a few that are useless in terms of the minor runes. Getting a 5% capture rate rune, while it will help you out in the early runs, generally you'll eventually want to upgrade that. Health runes are more or less useless, lifesteal and damage and rage also useless. Now this may change later on in the game, but for the current point where Raid 5 is the endgame content, that is the situation we're currently in. I'll be adding a note on top of this time frame if that does change in future. Now back into raids. The thing with raids, as opposed to going through, is when you go through flags, you'll only be able to use your character and your familiars. When you reach dungeons, you'll start being able to use your friends. Now, by obtaining stronger friends, you can then make it a lot easier for you to clear heroic. If you do start out, generally I would recommend going around town, or in this case I'm in the fishing area, and just adding a lot of people, potentially typing in chats if anyone can help you, and then you can generally make some strong friends which will be able to one-hit most of the areas for you in dungeons, making it just so much easier for you to farm. Now, once you've got into raids, as I said before, you'll basically need a full set of epics, maybe 1 legendary from the area as well, before you have enough stat points to make it to the next raid. Now with that out of the way, the next thing is PvP. So once you start going into PvP, I would suggest looking at the rewards and then determining how much you really want to commit to it. What I mean by that is you can do your general regen in however way you want, whether you wish to use them 5 at a time, 1 at a time, it doesn't really matter. However, I would definitely suggest in times where, let's say for example, there would be a, well, this is only minor rune, so it's not really something that I would really be caring too much about. But let's say for example you need the Mount Guts, you need the Critter Jelly, or something along those lines. I would definitely suggest finding out how much it would cost in terms of tickets for you to reach the next rank. So by next rank, let's say for example you're in the top 251 to 500. How much it would require for you to spend in tickets, so how many tickets for you to maintain a top 250 rank. Once you've determined this, you basically just need to find out whether it's worth going into your guild shop and spending your guild tokens on ticket pouches, or whether it's just worth spending them on energy in order to gain more experience and farm for your familiars more. One thing I would definitely recommend in relation to buying the energy is that you'd never want to craft your energy into the raid chart. It's never worth it. You can complete 3 dungeons, get much more experience, much more chance for loot, as well as you have the higher chance of getting multiple different familiars. So that also realistically goes for trials as well. Now the thing with trials is, depending on what difficulty you can do, I generally sit at 365 to 370. That's what I'm just doing at the moment, just to breeze through it fairly quickly. You get a point per difficulty, so obviously the higher you can do, the more points you'll get per run. Same thing goes for the rewards. You kind of want to look at how much it would cost you to get to the next rank. However, the issue with doing trials and gauntlets as opposed to PvP is that there's no real free way in terms of getting packs for this. So they are premium in terms of the packs. So definitely it is something that you would need to look into in a lot more depth if you are free to play or spending a minimal on the game. Now the next big thing comes to stat distribution while leveling up. So a lot of people tell people to do certain ways of doing their build, like 203, 101, 100, however you want to do it. Now for me, I would definitely recommend doing 100. The reasoning being that you don't really have a need to put anything into health if you're running anything other than a tank. You don't really need anything in speed if you're running a tank. Therefore, these two stats can be completely redundant depending on what build you want to do. By putting everything in attack, not only will it make your earlier game a lot easier in terms of you want to be a DPS when you're starting out, it will also allow you to play any build you want without having to re-roll your stats, because that does cost 200 gems, and you don't really want to be doing that every time you feel like changing builds, because later in the game, it definitely does come down to a lot of build changing based on what you're doing at the time and what your team would require you to use. Now, what I would suggest doing if you're willing to look into playing whatever build is, I guess, easiest to obtain, at the moment, with Raid 5 being the final area of content, the set from raids is the easiest set to get. Now, set is the, I guess, second highest tier of gear, but the most important. So there are mythics in the game, however, it's more important to have a 4 set than to have a full equipment of mythics. Now, let's say, for example, Raid 5 being the final set at the moment, it does drop this set here, the Nightwalker set. Now, this is a tank set, as you would be able to tell from the set bonuses it provides, in which case, it's best if you're able to turn yourself into a tank by the time you reach the raid, which means going for defensive pet and accessory. Now, this all does change based on your luck and your RNG, because when you do go for a pet, every pet egg does have 3 epics. Now, the epics do have the different, I guess, chance effects, being when you're hit, on turn, and when you hit an enemy. So these ones, as you can see here, are all 45% chance when you do that. You also have ones which are 20% everything. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear at the moment that any of those are actually showing in the eggs that we currently have available here, but there are other eggs. Now, another big thing is that there are Offence Pet Eggs. Now, Offence Pet Eggs are really good for PvP content, however, they aren't able to sustain you, so they're not really that good in terms of doing PvE content, which is the majority of the game. So definitely I would suggest that once you've got your pet, whether you get a legendary, whether it be Tobit or any of the others, like I'm currently using an Ergoth, I would definitely suggest that that is the sort of time in which you can start going for a DPS pet. Now, by DPS, I don't mean that by being a damage dealer you require one of these. Even as a damage dealer, you still do much better with a defensive pet. Now onto the accessory boxes. So currently there is a sale on accessory boxes. Now, it is best if you have an idea of what you want and it's on sale. So at the moment, trophies on sale for this box. However, there also is the hyper boxes, which just give you a chance at every single defensive accessory. I would definitely suggest that if there is an accessory box which has the accessory that you want, for example, at the moment, let's say I was going for a Melbourne stew, I could just buy this box until I got it. The only issue being in relation to that is, do I want the epics in that box as well? So as you can see in relation to it, it does appear that the epics in these two boxes are slightly similar in terms of this one. However, the rest of them are different. So we have evade, damage reduction here, but in this one we have evade, absorb, mix, and we have damage reduction, absorb, mix. So it really depends on if you're willing to risk out the more likely situation of the epic, as opposed to going for the higher chance at the legendary you want. So for me personally, I believe that the best defensive accessory is Trophy, so I would definitely go for this one if I was going to build a tank. Now, what you want to build can depend on how lucky you get with your familiar. So let's say, for example, I were to get this familiar here, Gusty. I would then have the difficult decision of whether I wanted to keep going for pets until I got a tanky pet. Otherwise, I would go for an offensive accessory to progress through like that. Now, what I would generally do in this type of a situation if I did get Gusty, at the moment, as I said, Raid 5 being the endgame content and having a tank set, is I would be going through and getting my tank accessory. However, I would go one pack into offense accessories and just upgrading a blue accessory of whatever I get, provided it's not lifesteal. Now, once you've got that completed, you've determined what build you want to run, you just realistically need to progress through the content until you get to the final raid. I would definitely not suggest realistically upgrading lower tier mythics or sets until you do have a full set and can start clearing all content. The one thing that I do see a lot of is a lot of players will go into World Boss, and as you can see here, tier 5, tier 3, sometimes you see quite low tier world bosses, which really isn't a good thing. So you can only start getting mythics and sets from tier 6. Well, you can only start getting epics from tier 6 and mythics from tier 7. There's not really a useful set currently based on the current meta from tier 6, so I wouldn't do world boss until at least tier 7. Due to the fact that you gain less experience than you would from a dungeon for the same energy, as well as you lose the familiar chance. So it's just not realistically worth it until you get to that tier of content. Now, there will be a few events which go on. Currently there's an invasion happening at the moment. There can be guild versus guild and things like that. I would definitely recommend using up all your natural regen, and by that I mean just the timed regen that you do get throughout the day, just to try and maximize how much gains you'll make over the shortest period of time that you can. Generally, I would log in every 8 hours when I started out, so logging in 3 times a day, just to try and get that all spent. Now, what I would suggest, as I said previously, if you're able to go in chat, a lot of the time the conversations are a little bit off topic from the game. However, definitely if you do wish to play some game questions in there, it is more than likely it will be someone that will be able to assist you with your question, or people willing to offer friend slots. Now, with that being said, the best thing to do early on is to try and join a guild, which is at least level 40. Now, the reason for this is once you reach level 40, you can start purchasing energy potions from your guild with your contribution. Now, by using this, it is something that you can definitely do in relation to trying to get as much XP as you can as fast as possible. The other good thing about the guild is if you are a free-to-play player, it opens you up to getting your early pet and accessory. Now, the pet for this one is pretty terrible, 20% chance to prevent death and heal you, but the accessory is actually not terrible. But obviously having that 20% chance is better than having nothing at all, so I would definitely suggest going for one of each first, especially if you're a free-to-play player. Now, with that information being said and done, I don't believe that there is much more to go over other than the fact that you need a lot of RNG in this game, and that there are quite large walls in the content in terms of difficulty. What I mean by that is you'll generally find yourself able to clear content extremely easy, breeze through it, and then all of a sudden your entire team will just be annihilated. So definitely it is a hard grind game. The only real way to get around that is to get more TS, which is your total stats, as all of your familiars will go up stats as you do. This can be obtained from leveling up, or getting higher tiers of gear, or upgrading your gear. So I definitely suggest that if you do get stuck, just go back to the areas in which you can grind for the familiars that you need for your legendary, and ensure that you are going to continue farming the highest difficulty you can in terms of raids as well. because in raids it will still cost you 1 shard, as opposed to dungeons having higher energy costs based on the difficulty. Raids will always be 1 shard. Now, if there is anything I missed out here, please leave a comment below. I'll look into getting an updated guide if there was anything I missed. The biggest thing in relation to this is just to have fun. It is a video game after all, that's the reason that we would play it. If you do wish to be a free-to-play player, you can definitely enjoy all the content of the game. I would definitely say at the moment, with Raid 5 being the final zone of content, is that it generally takes about 1 to 2 months in free-to-play time in order to get to that content. Now, what I would suggest as well is if you're able to look at the latest tier of content currently being Raid 5 and have an idea of when that came out and an idea of when people are speculating for new content. Now, the reason I would suggest this is if you base your character build around becoming, say for example at the moment, a tank, due to the fact that the raid content will provide you with the easiest set to obtain, being the tank set. If a new raid is due to come out shortly after, then it would be fairly redundant to go for that being your idea if by the time you get to Raid 5, Raid 6 is out, and it's a DPS set. So just keep in mind the timeframes of content release. You can generally ask in the Bit Heroes Discord in relation to releasing of content when it came out, things like that. Otherwise, I'll be leaving a comment below as to when Raid 5 was actually released, so that if anyone does wish to know based on when this video was made as to when the content came out to get an idea of that, that'll be in the comments below. So hopefully this has helped you out in terms of starting out. The only other key thing I would suggest is the enchants. Now, the best thing to do is go for enchants based on your role. You don't really want to go for them on stats. It's much better to have 1% of something than to have 1 stat in something. Alright. Well, thanks for watching the guide. As I said before, if there is any sort of criticism or anything I've missed, feel free to leave comments below.